Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming to an evening of poetry at Adrian's. Tonight, our featured poet is Professor Molly McGlennen. She was the Andrew W. Mellon Postdoctoral Fellow in Native American Studies at Vassar College from 2006 into 2008, and she is still teaching there. She earned her PhD in Native American Studies from the University of California, Davis in 2005, her MFA in Creative Writing and English from Mills in 1998, and her BA English and Philosophy from the University of San Diego in 1994. Her research and teaching interests include Native American literature, contemporary poetry, Native American feminisms and urban experiences, Native American visual culture, and poetry writing. McGlennen helped establish the Native American Studies Correlate within the American Studies program at Vassar and has served as the NAS advisor since its inception in 2009. Molly McGlennen is the author of 2 collections of poetry, Fried Fish and Flour Biscuits from Salt Publishing in 2010, and Our Bearings, University of Arizona Press, 2020. So if you all join me in giving Molly McGlennen a nice warm Poughkeepsie welcome.
So thank you for having me, and I think the last time that I may have participated in this reading series is, well before COVID. I think I had primarily from my first book, Fried Fish and Flour Biscuits, so I won't read much from that. I'll read more from this book because it came out right as the pandemic hit in 2020. March 2020 is when it came out. So I was lined up to do all these readings, which was really exciting. And then they were all put to this new phenomenon called Zoom. So that's the way my book debuted in the world. But that's okay. I'm still in love with it, though I am starting to write some new stuff, and we'll see where that takes me. But I'm a slow writer, and it takes me a while to figure out the project. So, but this one I felt was a very welcome. Hello. Just starting. So, had a very specific thesis. I had a very specific idea in mind for this book, Our Bearings. By the way, I'm in love with the artwork on the front. It's Frank Big Bear, who's an Ojibwe artist from Minneapolis. One of the things that I think my bio didn't reveal is that I was born and raised in Minneapolis, Minnesota. So all my family's from there, born and raised there. I go back there often. It's sort of the creative place that I go to for my writing. It's culture and landscape and all of that. And so this book, in a way, was a homage to Minneapolis, and what my bio did reveal is that I have these degrees in Native American Studies, and on my mom's side, we're Ojibwe descendants. So I think a lot about this and what it means to now live in Poughkeepsie, New York, or having lived for many years in California, to still maintain my connections to home, only being able to go home a few times a year. So what I did was I set out with some funding from Vassar College to do some what I was calling experiential research, which is essentially just paid visits to go back home, which I was already doing anyway. But this time, it was with 2 kids in tote, and we would go to old stomping grounds and new places. We'd be visitors. We'd go to we went to Fort Snelling. We went, all over with my mom or with my family, my brother, my extended family, aunts, uncles, whoever, and just kind of experience the place again, or be a tourist and get the brochures out and learn how, my home was being represented to the community. And so I had been always in contact with a good friend of mine, Ben Burgess, who I always give props to with this book, because as we spoke about both being Ojibwe peoples from Minnesota, living away, and now he lives back, how we think about a city as an indigenous homeland. And just for those of you who don't know, you probably know that over half of indigenous peoples in the United States live in cities, right? So it's not a special phenomenon, right? It's a quite common phenomenon for people to not live in home communities or reservations, but to live in cities. And that was on purpose because the U.S. government had a policy called urbanization, it's called relocation in the 1950s, that brought a lot of peoples off the reservation to cities, and where people still find themselves today. And what happened was Native peoples intertribally found one another, formed these long-standing enclaves in the city that are still, exist, right? And culturally sort of, thrive to this day. And so places like Minneapolis, that's a big one. Denver, Milwaukee, Seattle, Los Angeles, the Bay Area, New York City, right? These are places with a lot of indigenous peoples, but they're often, right, the invisible people. So what did it mean? So he said to me, that my friend, to go back to my friend, he said that we have to have a homeland, to call yourself indigenous, you have to have a homeland, and for this to happen in the city, the Ojibwe must claim the city as their territory. So I started to think about, well, what would that claiming be? What would that claiming look like, or possibly look like? And I know in a Western way, claiming can be a really violent action. It can be divisive, like claiming land, stealing land, right? Claiming property, claiming things and objects. And I thought in an indigenous way, claiming might be inclusive or intertribal, or offer a sense of belonging, or be relational. Like that's what was the spirit that was driving my conceptions of mapping the city in this indigenous way. So that was my thesis for the book. It's sort of long-winded. That was supposed to be really short. Sorry. I'll get to the poems. But that was sort of what I was thinking about. So I literally, I have this book. It's in 4 sections, 4 directions, right? 4 elements, the 4 elements. And then to get myself, for you writers in the room, to get myself to continue to write the next poem, often I would, whatever line I ended the last poem with, I'd use some, either exactly or some form of that line for the first line for the new poem. So there's a lot of continuity like that throughout the book. And then I also numbered, there's a lot of serial poems, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, right? So poems that had a title with 1 to 4 throughout. It was a book that was both kind of woven between long prose poems where the lines are stretched out long, very story-like, and then the next poem might be really lyrically experimental and be all spattered all over the page and be sort of minimal. So there was a braiding of different styles. I was really thinking a lot about and fascinated with form in this book as well. So I'll shut up and I'll read some poems. So I'll just read a smattering of a few poems across some of these series so you can get a feel for it. So let me start with a good story, though. I'll start with the story poem. This is called Bearings 1. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah? Okay. Yeah? Good, okay. My cousins and I played cards with my grandma. Become accustomed to the buzz of the wobbling floor fan set to the highest speed. She is waiting for her daughters, my aunties, to come home. They've worked construction all summer. Their brothers, iron workers, crane and elevator operators, tipped them off about the jobs. The two would hold the stop and slow signs for oncoming traffic through heat and rain and clouds of dirt. Now they walk in, pull off bandanas full of sweat, which have been wrapped around their foreheads all day. They wear dust-covered jeans and boots and, like always, Maybelline fake eyelashes full of thick black mascara. This time, one of my aunts is crying, and as she's crying, I watch her trying to pull off those fake eyelashes. She's saying something about getting fired in between her weeping and cursing, and something about being fed up with the comments from the guys at the site about her jeans and her sleeveless t-shirt, and how she will go back to waitressing even though construction pays more, and how she and her sister should give this up for good. It's only seasonal. But come spring, like my uncles, they will each step out from the long Minnesota winter and get in line with all the rest, wanting something better and hoping this time they won't catch anyone's eye, and this time keeping their heads down a little lower. Thank you. So I'll switch that. This is Bearings 3, and it's a very lyrical poem, so it's very different. The relevance of this: a loon stays underwater for several minutes, dives for food as deep as murky lake bottom or protection. Tremolo echo knows home and surfaces and the runways of water. Could be leeches, smelt, minnows, nest never far from water's edge, moss and pine needles. A pair tends to this quiet, their natal lake, again and again, a life returning. This is Bearings 4. When we were water, we joined as we needed, were protected, knew to come back round. When we were water, we were patient for rain and knew its arrival, forecasted by purple sky. When we were water, days worked in circles and years concentrically until we knew our beginnings. When we were water, we dove and scouted like loons, swallowed pebbles by night. When we were water, we turned into ourselves, leaving behind what was no longer essential. When we were water, we turned into ourselves, claimed by heart circles that have never washed away. So that was from the first section. The first section is entitled Earth. So now we're moving into air. And I will read a couple from the series Development. There's a story. This is where we did go to Fort Snelling. Fort Snelling sits at the confluence of the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers. And those rivers run right through the middle of Minneapolis, St. Paul. The Mississippi starts way up, their headwaters is way up in northern Minnesota. And Mississippi finds itself all the way down into the Louisiana, right? But at that confluence where that tributary comes into the Mississippi, there's the Fort Snelling, and that's where Dakota were after their uprising, right? Their uprising. There's I'm forgetting the number right now. Thousands of Dakota imprisoned there, and so you can go and be a tourist and see, and there's people sort of dressed up in the times, right? You can have your tour. So when we went to visit, my mom and I, Ellie and Marcelo, my kids, we went down. We didn't want to go in there. We went down this bank, down by the river, and it was just sitting there at that bench where this idea came for a lot of these poems. Okay, so Development 1. A map so clearly reflects its maker. Look, 494 and its cousin freeways loop the whole city. You see inventions, Mall of America, Kohl's, passageways to an international airport. Notice all of the crackerbox houses to the south, built after the war. Geography only illuminates for some. You could make the entire circle if you keep missing the exits. From the west, 394 jams despite added carpool lanes. If this poem is a map, this is how you channel back to yourself. If this poem is the exit ramp, watch for signs. You're someplace else. New signposts, you think, but there through the lines of birch like parchment, each one lifts off, rises above you. You hear yourself from the past. You hear yourself. Development 2. This is another story. As children, we learned that my father grew up on the west side. Saw the building that was once the corner store he bagged groceries at after school. The block now readies itself for chic luxury apartments that no one who survived the Vietnam era could ever afford. And it was on the north side that my mother would waitress and meet the Army officer, handfuls of straws standing up from her apron pocket. They've always switched the story of who offered whom the first cigarette. My brother would be born on the south side, the one-room apartment. He might have slept in a drawer for the first year. And there's that story of the cradle in which my sister and I, at different points, would be laid down to sleep each night. I'm told we've circled this city for a very long time. Eventually, we moved out to Western Fringe, where my dad would get a job with Honeywell, building Mark 46 bombs for the war during the day, attending law school at night on his GI Bill. This may be where he first met the Belcourts and the Banks. Honeywell was friendly to Indians at first, until some organized. Every Christmas, John B. calls from prison. We still run into Clyde at IDS Crystal Court. Marks another year, our calendar of comings and goings, of jail time and freedom, car crashes and diplomas, war and sobriety, like a glint. The gesture of story incites our design, the directions we know to be constant with who we are, right there, always there. Okay. I'll read this one because when I was driving over here from my son's open house for school, I saw ladies only basketball happening on the court up the street, and I love that. I was a basketball player. I thought that was the coolest thing because I usually only see men over there playing. Mm-hmm. So.
Right, you're on the court.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. Awesome. It was awesome. So this has a little bit of basketball in here, so I'll just read this one. Development 3. With purpose, they widen their circle. Intimate knowledge obliges their residents, claims to the city. A place of comings and goings, for teachings and places to teach, for the science of construction and of architecture, age-old practices where astronomers measure the stars and their tracks and draw the world on birch bark and rock, how they piece themselves together, always insisting on an abiding filament that secures existence, future, to vegetable gardens, cooking classes, ladies only basketball at the center, no matter the gathering, digging for roots, pulling beets alongside a busy court, a restored playground. The science of observation never dims, nor resilience, keeps widening late into the afternoons when a new story is etched on a bench, #indigenous mentality. Okay, how are we doing for time? We're okay. Okay. Let me see. So then I have a series of poems about being another tributary of the Minnesota River, which goes into the Mississippi, is the Snake River, which we did a lot of canoeing growing up. And these Snake River poems were actually the first poems that I wrote for the book, but they don't show up until the third section, water. And these are those poems that sort of zigzag across like a river across the page. So I'll read a few of these in order because they actually pick up that last line, first line thing, so you'll hear that. So this is Snake River. Put these glasses on. Rocks and pebbles deserve such rinsing. Make sand, make furrows that groove a way for birch bark, now aluminum, canoes to carve these trails, immediately erased and retraced again in luminous mornings when paddle dips water, makes L's and reverse L's, and all are compelled to swiftness and breeze, and this great dawning repeated when a muskrat emerges, climbs banks lined with ash, retreats beyond vision, all move as they've always moved toward home. Snake River 2, always moving toward home, whether outbound, a push from bank, hop in, stay low, Weather back again, arms full of good aches, scent of walleye, almost too low sun. It could be any day in your life or mine. Together this river story weaves protocol and compass, kinnikinnick and camels, holds the quiet sculling patterns where hands mimic older hands, revealing journeys across poplars, spring flooding, filling lives no matter, oars sweeping down into the thick, storied roots, the ones we've known by heart, to tell ourselves in the calm of paired travelers. Snake River 3. A pair of travelers is not how this river... Start again. A pair of travelers is not how this river named itself, nor how it formed its curves. The camber of floating wood must have had something to do with it, and the way enemies were named. But here in the hiss of morning, we stop by his dock, ask if he's got minnows. We can talk about bait for hours and river depths, water slapping against the posts, before we continue through shadows and bright sun and each precious bend tucked away. So that is a sample of some Snake River poems. Let's see here. I don't think, just because we have some time, like 10 minutes maybe. Are you okay? Is everybody okay? Okay. Yeah. Maybe I will. I don't think I've ever read this one out loud. And then I'll read some lighter ones at the end. But so part of the research that I was doing for the book as well is with my dad at the Minnesota Historical Society Archives, which is in St. Paul, Minnesota. And we had found out, which is a long story that I won't divulge here, but that there were there were just like stacks and stacks and stacks that we were able to retrieve out of the archives after doing research of letters between the superintendent of a state school, Owatonna State School for orphans, and my dad's great-grandmother and her sisters, right? So, or I'm sorry, my dad's great-grandparents writing about their children, wanting them to come home, and the superintendent never responding to them. And so there's, it's written in hand, and then the superintendent typed. So the poem will tell a lot about that experience, but that was part of some of the research that I was doing that was as much about what we were finding in those documents, but I would say it was probably more so about the experience of sitting there with my dad, trying to go through these documents, trying to comprehend cruelty to young children that were his grandma who raised him in Minneapolis, all through the 1940s after his mom died when he was very young. So, crying with my dad was as much as part of the research, than finding these documents. So anyway, this is part of the Carouse series, so I will read it. It's kind of long, but it tells a lot of the story. In the Minnesota Historical Society archives rest boxes full of files recording many of the personal correspondences between my father's grandmother, great-aunties, great-grandparents, and the state of Minnesota. One past summer, my dad and I discovered these archives, and in particular, many of the letters that his great-grandparents had sent the state school in Owatonna, an orphanage that claimed to save neglected children and transform them into productive members of society. This place, where 3 of their children were taken by court order, one of whom was my dad's grandma, who would eventually raise him in Minneapolis in the 1940s after my mom died at a very young age. 3 little girls snatched from their small home one New Year's Eve after the family had just been evicted from yet another apartment. For days, it seemed, I sat there with my dad, reading each excruciating handwritten letter in which his great-grandma and grandpa begged the state to return their children, how much they loved and missed them. And we would read through each typed letter from the superintendent of the school, repeating how the children would never see the letters, could not, for their own good. They were unfit parents. After 1 year at the orphanage, my dad's grandma was outed at 13 years old to rural Minnesota farmers. When the farmer's wife died, he married my dad's grandma. He was in his 50s, she in her late teens. As I was next to my dad, trying to comprehend cruelty, I also tried to envision his great-grandparents penning dozens upon dozens of letters, when that paper and that stamp must have been an expense they could not easily afford, when the archives revealed newspaper reportings of a kidnapping of one of the daughters, Lucille, when, from the letters, it was clear that her parents designed a plan to bring a lonely child back home to their apartment in Minneapolis, when the state misled the parents to think if they could secure a new place, the girls would come stay with them, when the state came and snatched the girls when the parents were gone, when a lawyer deceived them and took off with their money, did nothing to help retrieve the girls from their placement homes, when the girls devised plans of escape. Over and over in the letters, I ask you, if you please, would you send my kids back to Minneapolis? I got a good home for them. We feel so alone and we cannot sleep. Over and over, the girls have done no wrong. It was very unjust to deprive them of their God-given liberty, and they should be home with their mother where they belong. Over and over, drunkard, unfit mother, immoral, institution, indentured, incorrigible, state guardian, over and over, return to sender. Thank you for letting me read that. I don't think I've read it out loud at a reading. Thank you. Yeah.
I just, your father's grandmother, they sent her to a farmer that she had to marry, and he was 50, and she was like in her teens.
She was sent there as a domestic to work in he and his wife's farm, but when the wife died, he took her, the grandmother, as his wife, yeah. And she was in her, by then, late teens. So she worked as a domestic, a servant.
Did she have his children?
Yes.
And that's where your father's mother was born.
Yeah.
If you go to Arizona, the Native American Museum in Arizona, it was the second floor. Is you walk in and you see a boarding school. Hear clippings of scissors, and they show you. You walk through. They show you exactly what happened to them. Deprived of their hair, and as you walk the gauntlet, it's all of the stories from when they were older, but when they were children, of like someone tried to run away, how they were treated, how they were cruelly. I'm having a flashback to that.
Yeah.
And it's just that's what we did in this country to civilize.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's I mean, a lot of Native families will talk about that's the moment that complete dysfunction, the moment the first generation of kids went to the boarding schools marks the moment in that family line that dysfunction, or trouble started, right? Real trouble, because that trauma, doesn't just die off with that generation. It's inherited, right? And it's passed on. And we know that even epigenetically, we inherit that through our chemistry, our DNA. And there's, this is a common story, sadly, to civilize the savage. That was America's project for about a century. But I will turn to some celebratory reasons I love Minneapolis. Can I do that?
Yeah.
So, first of all, Prince. I love Prince and music, and his club, First Ave. I used to go there all the time and hear all the best music in the world. So I'm going to end with 3 poems that are kind of celebrate Minneapolis and why I love it, why it's great. So this first one is Ode to First Avenue. Has anyone ever been there before, by the way? Oh, if you're ever in Minnesota, I don't know, and you go to Minneapolis, just go to First Ave and 7th Street, the corner, and you will see this historic building that he created. Okay. Last summer, your ceiling collapsed. I wasn't there, but I read about it. Papers said that the crash pulled down some of the sprinkler systems onto the rockers below. Back in the 90s, when I was your greatest patron, I sneaked through your doors and would be face to face with those luminaries come real. The Time, LL Cool J, Ben Harper, Fishbone, A Tribe Called Quest, Maceo, the Fugees. Every time I'd eye the crowd for Prince, wanted to be the lucky one to be invited back to his purple mansion on Lake Minnetonka. Alas, never. But by evening's end, what did it matter? I had danced through each grain belt, danceteria style. Locals will know what that means. Oh, how I miss your star-studded entry. Each time I return home, I look for new ones that I may not have noticed. For each Purple Rain remnant, glam slam memory, I squint and see the corner once before. Greyhound bus station that brought in relocation signees, a suitcase and a few dollars of hope, walking out into a world of promises, some kept, most broken, toward Franklin Avenue, the Phillips neighborhood. Young single mothers, $12 a week cleaning houses, hotels, forming enclaves, and Indian centers, and the backbones of hard-fought organizing. Oh, First Ave, if I stop long enough, you've always been a comings and goings corner, hearts broken and healed, ceilings collapsing and rising again, new sets of dancers and artists connecting the way, each painted white star that dots the rows of dream-filled cylinder blocks. Oh, First Ave, you've always been the heat of gathering places across years of resilience, across generations of people, folding the luminary of hope into their purses or pockets and walking out into the night. So this is Ode to Prince. I love it. You can snap if that's snappable. So this is Ode to Prince. There's a story in our family, that my dad's good friend still has some of Prince's platform shoes in his attic. Prince would come to practice music in his family's basement, so much so that over the years, my dad's friend talked about the grocery bags full of his stuff just sitting up there. In fact, it was the mother of my dad's friend who had taken Prince into her home, one already filled with 6 children of her own, when Prince had been kicked out of his by his father. It's a good story. I never thought much about it until the day I heard that Prince passed away in his Chanhassen mansion. From my surrogate home in Poughkeepsie, New York, I watched on TV the masses of people surrounding the estate out there in that swelling western suburb. They put flowers and mementos all along the fenced property, but I kept thinking about those shoes sitting up in the attic. I imagined what it would be like to hold one in my hand at that moment. Prince loved Minnesota. When asked by West and East Coast media folks why he didn't move permanently to Los Angeles or Manhattan, he said, "I will always live in Minneapolis. It's so cold, it keeps the bad people out." And when Oprah asked him the same thing, he said, "Why would I? Minneapolis has everything I need." Those words endeared him to Minnesotans, who had already been claiming him as theirs since his first hit, which is odd, because he was anything but someone else's. Like those discarded shoes, it didn't matter. He was already gone. And perhaps in the attic of our minds, it becomes those stories we must tell until they are what we need. Okay. Well, I'm going to read 2 more, and I'll stop. Okay, so this is another story poem. So my mom is one of 8 kids, I think I might have said that, who grew up in Minneapolis. And yeah, I'll just leave it at that. So it's about that side of the family. There are ways we never talk about what is right in front of us, too afraid. Or like a phantom limb, vivid perceptions of a fiction remain. You think and feel the severed portion still attached. One of my diabetic uncles recently had half his leg amputated. He is the youngest boy of my grandparents' 8 children, lives in Northeast and not truck driving anymore. He used to deliver milk all over the western Twin Cities area, and I heard he is still not sober. The Christmas he came late to my auntie's duplex in St. Paul, my sister and I slid in our socks on the old wood floors, trying not to draw attention to ourselves. We got cornered in the tiny kitchen. I was teased of thoughts for going to college and my sister for practicing and performing her violin. We put food on our plates and slipped out. I asked my mom how he gets around now. I don't know, she said. A cane, a chair, a fake leg. A fiction, I think. It rests in the outline of our absences, slipping in and out of rooms, living one piece at a time on that plate in our memories, until the only connective tissue is the stories we have of ourselves. In this story of us, however, we are not ghosts. We are not diabetics or the first college grad or a creaking floorboard or truck drivers. We are not the youngest or the oldest, sober or drunk. We are not severed or whole, cities or suburbs. We are not what they call us, nor what we call ourselves. We are only what we want to say. And I will end, and thank you for listening, and I'm open to any questions or anyone who wants to get up and read some poems. I'd love to hear that too. So I'll end on this one. It was it's Remains 4. It's the last poem of the collection, and it was one of those poems I knew I had to sign off on this collection. It was the last poem I wrote, and I was just thinking, I was just so freed by the fact that it was coming together. And so in that freedom, poetry is this place of freedom, right? I just wrote kind of whatever was coming to mind. It was a lot of free association, and this poem just came out in a flurry. So it ends up being the last poem of the collection that really celebrates my love of Minnesota. She wants to write about basketball in this poem, and number 21, always a Timberwolf, Kevin Garnett. She wants to say Defensive Player of the Year and franchise records in this poem. She wants to be able to just utter the fact that she was there, finally made it to the Target Center for one of his last nights in the NBA. She was there. She wants to just type the word hip-hop in her poem, like it is the last poem to write, where there are no rules about what she can say or not say, think or not think. She wants to speak the names Tall Paul and Chase Manhattan in her poem because she's a fan. Because if she's honest, basketball and hip-hop matter, sometimes more than poetry. Wants to shout out 90s R&B, Mint Condition and Next, and Morris Day. Wants to just keep listing things because they sound good out loud, like KMOJ 89.9, and she can imagine saying them out loud, the way poems are supposed to come into the world. She just keeps scribbling without thoughts of editors or colleagues about what she ought to type or censor, because when it comes down to it, she'd rather think about basketball and hip-hop and 90s R&B and talk about it too, with someone who loves it all the same, someone who knows every street she utters in her poems and the corners and every person who's died and who's still living, every hospital visit and wedding and giveaway, every canoe trip and coffee house, every lake and swamp. She wants to give those words all the way to that person again and again, and with them trace and retrace the designs embossed in her memories, the fibers that become the maps of home. Thank you for listening.
So, I was wondering, so this book that you were just reading from, how long did it take you to write?
That's a good question.
Like over 7 years or 10 years or
Yeah,
3 years?
I have this memory, I would say probably like 7 years. I have this memory of doing a reading with this book, which came out in 2010, so maybe it was a couple years after, and I was already starting to write some of the Snake River. So maybe 7-8 years. However, it was just a sprinkling of poems, and like I said at the beginning, I have a hard time seeing what I'm writing, or rather how they might be threaded together, these poems. I have a hard time seeing what that is until I have until I get into like a groove, or I have a question, or I have a project in mind, or the outline of it. So the meat of it was written probably just in a year, but there was sprinklings of poems over 4 or 5 years that led up to that. And then of course the publishing takes a while, and it came out in 2020.
That was a great gift, if you will, that you were able to do that research with your father.
Yeah.
That you didn't find all this after he had passed, but that it just seemed like so fortuitous that you were able to
do it
that
with
together.
And it wasn't my project. It was really something he's always talked about, because he was really cut off from his family after his mom died, so he was just always wanting to do this. We knew that there were probably these things that sat over in these archives, but it just was like finally he asked me if I would do that with him. So then we did, and we did it together, and it was just, it was fortuitous because there was this opportunity with these research time, mostly it's time, right, to be able to do it, as well as the funding, but the time to just go and do it. So it really was, and he was healthy and stuff. So, and he's still living, and but he's 80, so it would have been a little bit harder as time goes on. So it was really good.
Was it like, the experience of it, doing it with them together, the first thing that came to my mind was just what, I think it might have been the Archbishop, what was going on in Canada.
Yeah.
How was that, for him, like, was it like, does he have memory gaps, or was this something he wanted to, be there present with you in sharing it, like, was it like, I can imagine it must have been haunting. I had an experience with my father. I took him to see Saving Private Ryan, and he had a flashback in the theater. And when he got home, he just talked about, he just opened up and shared. And I was just like, oh my goodness.
Like, where did it come from all of a sudden? Yeah. Like something opens up. Mm-hmm. That's maybe exactly the kind of feeling. It was like a valve opened, and, suppressed, repressed, forgotten on purpose. The way our trauma works and things like that. Mm-hmm. It's like it's not ready till it's ready, or it's not there till it's there. And he had been talking for a couple of years, like, let's, I'm gonna just check in on a birth certificate. He was doing the stuff that he could do, as much as any, like, I'm not a researcher either, but I at least can find my way around libraries and archives a little bit from doing, getting a higher degree, a graduate level degree. But, it was just doing it together was really important. And in fact, I remember I was doing a talk at Vassar with Ford scholars, and I had talked a little bit about how this book was coming together. It was right in maybe 2015. It was starting to come together, and maybe 2016. It was right after we had found those documents, and we had had that experience over the summer together. And I talked a little bit about that in connection to the larger point I was trying to make in the talk. And then someone in the Q&A said, oh, well, what are you going to do with all those documents? Because they're just like, I have like reams and reams of paper. It took like a couple trees to like make, copy all this off. But we wanted it all, so that we could go through it on our own time, because you can only spend so much time in that archive before they kick, it's like a library. You have hours and stuff. So, and someone was like, when they asked that question, I said, oh, I don't know. And they said, you should publish those letters. And I said, and it just like dawned on me, like, oh my God, no, no way. And then I was thinking, like, well, the most meaningful way for me to express the context of those letters is to share through poetry the emotion of being there with my dad. That, like, poetry was the only way I could house and share that information for me as a poet. And I think my dad understood that and understands me in that way, like that seemed exploitative somehow. Or, do you think of like at that museum you were at, the way any piece of history often gets curated in a museum, it can be behind glass and nameless and faceless a lot of the times. And I don't know, poetry was a sort of a more dynamic way to present this and deal and kind of work writing poetry allows me to work through these problems, and then allows me the language to then speak with my dad about this. But yeah, he was he just feels like he has some like story now, like with him, that he didn't have, like connected the dots a little bit for him. It was horrendous though, yeah, and frightening and weird, because I didn't know his mom or his grandma. They were dead well before I was born. But
no, it just sounds like just with what's happening down the border.
Yeah.
Like it's a similar situation where you've just deprived, and there's no link.
Yeah.
To where the families are, and I'm hearing you. I'm like, oh my God, like that's the other part of our great nation.
Yeah.
We have that dark side, and it's still prevalent.
Yeah, that everyone wants connection. Every human wants connection, and different groups of people find that and know that know that to be through different means and ways. And for us, it's it's connection to a place that holds the experiences of the people that came before you. And when there's gaps in those teachings and those experiences and the way that they are passed along, it can be like something's missing in your sense of self. So perhaps that's how my dad was feeling. I'm sure my mom feels a lot of that. But they love the book, and that's helpful. So, I don't know. There's something magical about poetry too, in the way that it can piece things together, and I'm really at some level that I think other ways of expression can't. So
that piece is in this the art bearings.
Yes, the my dad one. Yeah.
And what element is that in?
Oh, I don't know
how you categorized.
That one is in, I believe, air. Yeah. Am I right? Yeah, because it comes before. I'm sorry.
Oh,
I think it's air. Yeah. No. It's not. It's water. It comes after the Snake River. It's water. Yeah.
Was there conscious effort, or did they just kind of fall into elements when you were, obviously the Snake River poems, to me, automatically fall in water, but.
Yes, it was purposeful. Like the poems that start off the collection are like, just these like really present tense poems of me like cruising around Minneapolis when I used to work downtown for the mayor. And I don't know if anyone, like I said, if you've been to Minnesota, it's so cold there that all the skyscrapers are connected by these walkways on the second floor, so you don't have to go outside. So if you want to go from one skyscraper building to the other, you just walk on the second floor through these skyways that take you across the streets. You don't have to go outside. Anyway, so there's these poems that are kind of like mapping me, like going around, like cruising around the city. And I knew that was Earth, and then there's these poems about like literal, like the joggers around the lakes and whatever, all these like really earthy, grounded things. And I knew the Snake River ones had to go in water. And I knew that those memories of canoeing with my dad and mom and my my brother and sister when I was little were connecting me somehow to, I don't know, find like what my dad and I were sort of doing in that process, finding our way. So I just saw that those came, I just felt like they needed to come after those Snake River poems of navigating and finding our way.
It's beautiful.
It's Thank you.
Such a beautiful book.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, it felt good when it came out. And also the other thing when it came out too, that spring was when the murder of George Floyd. Mm-hmm. And so I was getting like, texts from friends that were there, like you know, the community was like patrolling the Phillips neighborhood on those nights, you know, not because they were against the protests, but rather they were part of those protests, but they were also patrolling against the looters and all of that. They wanted to protect their neighborhood because they knew that their neighborhood was vulnerable, right? Particularly Phillips neighborhood was where the Native neighborhood in Minneapolis. So he was texting me and they were videoing. So the one on the first nights, you know, there's like smoke and my parents are like, everyone's having like headaches, you know, and there's helicopters, all this stuff this is happening. And
everything was on fire.
Everything's on.
That's where.
Yeah, and you know, everything's on fire, and like this horrific basically a public hanging just, you know, happened in Minneapolis with George Floyd. It was horrendous and frightening, and so these people were coming from all over because, you know, so something would get broken, you know, the at nights when people were protesting, people were coming from all over, especially like young kids, and were, you know, looting like the liquor stores or whatever. And then the police station burned down. Then the McGlennen Center, which is a Native-run, owned, operated center for Native youth, that got burned down. It was super sad, you know, like, so they were protecting, you know, their neighbor, just patrolling, right? And here's these two kids. These two like white boys, they caught them looting, and so what they did was these Native folks, they like put them on the curb, and then they filmed them, and they said, where's your mom? You know, and they said, what's your phone number? Like, you have a phone? Let's call her. They called their moms, and those moms came from Wisconsin and picked those boys up.
Wisconsin?
Yes.
What were they doing in?
To come, whatever, wreak havoc.
You're kidding.
No, and I'm not, and it's on video.
They ran away from home to go loot in
They
Minnesota.
drive, yeah, and then their moms came. But I just thought, what an incredible thing to witness the, you know, in the context of all that happening. That was their, like, instinct to say, okay, where's your mom? You need to go home. Not to beat them or kick their asses or call the police or da-da-da-da. No. So I just thought that blew my mind when I saw that. So loving, and it was such a.
Know that too.
And it was such a telling detail about that moment in Minneapolis. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that for me it just connects to that poem about the IDS and Clyde and John B. Calls from those are all those activists, those AIM activists that would be at our house, or we knew, you know, so because Minneapolis is the home of the American Indian movement, so. That moment connected to all that long-standing history of indigenous activism in Minneapolis, and then this book came out right before that. So when I was doing readings, that was happening, and I couldn't help but make that connection toward that history. That's always been there, you know, and so. Claiming that city, like I didn't need to do that. Like that is I'm already part of that tradition in Minneapolis. Not me personally, but you know what I mean? I'm connected to that's been there. And I don't know, it was just a really, I don't know, a lot of things sort of came together at this moment when it came out, so.
Yeah, and that it was just such a frightening place to be.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
It's like, we got to get these boys out of here because this is not a place for anybody to be, right?
No, and like, what are you doing?
They
Like,
don't have a reason to be there.
no.
They're just willing to get in the fray.
Yeah. Yeah.
That is such a great story. Thank you for that story.
That's a good story. Yeah.
That's an amazing story.
Yeah.
You know, we should that could be the one told. Like, so this is what this community did that's been deified and fear mongering, and that their instinct was to do this. Just like, you know, get your kids home.
Yeah. 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 Exactly. So. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
you're
you so
welcome.
much.
Thank you for allowing me to spend some time.